Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks, what links narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, with borderline personality disorder, BPD? So what this question is really asking is there some sort of characteristic that in some meaningful way really links these two together conceptually so that we can look at the same perhaps origin or central characteristic in both disorders. So I had to think about this one for a while and read a little bit more specifically on each disorder and how they're conceptually framed. So looking at different psychoanalytic thought around the subject. And I found an interesting article specifically about NPD. I'll put that reference in the description for this video. But I also looked at a lot of different sources and drew on my experience and kind of came up with an idea that I think makes sense. So let's first take a quick look at NPD and BPD and talk about how there could be a connection between these two and why that actually is a little difficult to conceptualize. So if we look at NPD, we see grandiosity, having fantasies of success and power, jealousy, entitlement, arrogance, feeling special or unique, manipulating other people, needing admiration, and having a lack of empathy. So just looking at the symptom criteria, we don't see a lot of overlap with borderline personality disorder. With borderline, we see symptoms like frantic efforts to avoid abandonment. We see splitting in relationships, so an unstable relationship pattern. Identity disturbance, so an unstable self-image. Impulsivity, suicidal behavior. Emotional dysregulation, a feeling of emptiness, anger, and paranoia. So again, we don't see a lot of overlap just strictly looking at the symptom criteria. If we add what we call the associated characteristics and put that together with the symptom criteria, there are a few elements you can look at here and say, well, this seems to be present in both to some extent. Like the fantasy component. We see a fantasy component in both NPD and BPD. Jealousy we certainly see in both. A need for admiration, I'd say that would certainly be present in both. And to some extent the sense of entitlement. Now the anger would actually be in both, and that's probably one of the more salient features of the disorders in terms of what connects them. But none of these I mentioned really seem like a core feature, a core factor that would connect NPD and BPD. Now in prior videos I discussed different theories I had about the core of NPD and the core of BPD. And I suggested that the core of NPD might be something like self-deception. And the core of BPD, I believe, is that identity disturbance piece. But is there a factor that can really link these two together that you could also call core, something like a core? So I thought about this again and read a lot on this topic and drew on my experience, as I mentioned before. And I came up with an idea that I think makes some degree of sense anyway. Perhaps it's fear. Perhaps when you look at these two disorders together and you try to say, well, what really connects them? It's actually fear. If we look at NPD, there's a fear of failure, a fear of being seen as weak, a fear of being vulnerable, and a fear of being less than perfect. So someone with NPD does not want to admit to anyone that they made a mistake or that they have flaws. Now with BPD, it's fairly easy to see the fear here as well. It's a fear of abandonment. So you have different fears here in NPD and BPD, but fear does seem to be something that connects these two disorders together. So then moving a little bit further with this discussion, is there really a common fear? So I've identified fear, but again, they're different fears. Is there really a common fear? Is there some way to link these two disorders together with one fear or with certain specific fears? So I came up with some ideas here as well. We see with both there could be a fear of shame, right? For different reasons perhaps, but a fear of shame seems to be something common to them. Also a fear of trust. People with NPD tend not to trust other individuals, and individuals with BPD have difficulties with trust. And maybe the shame and the trust really come down to a fear of betrayal, Both are really concerned about being betrayed. And perhaps all these together, being simplified even further, come down to a fear of pain, which makes a lot of sense. We see a lot of mental disorders, to one degree or another, are based on avoiding pain. They're a fear of pain that becomes dysregulated. So this may be an interesting theory, but one of the difficulties here is this theory wouldn't seem to hold up very well if you couldn't include the other disorders from cluster B, the other cluster B personality disorders, which would be antisocial and histrionic. In order for fear to really be something that connects NPD and BPD, and to strongly support that, it would kind of have to be a crucial factor for antisocial personality disorder and histrionic personality disorder, or at least that would make the case a lot stronger. Well, with histrionic personality disorder, I think we can make a case for fear. Fear of not being the center of attention. And interestingly, NPD and BPD both share this fear as well. Now, with antisocial personality disorder, this gets a lot tougher, because a lack of fear actually seems to define that disorder to some degree. But is that true? So if we think about antisocial personality disorder and NPD, we think of the overlap as really NPD and psychopathy. So antisocial personality disorder is a particular type of psychopathy. Specifically, antisocial personality disorder is related to secondary psychopathy. So we see traits like impulsivity, irresponsibility, and committing crimes. But primary psychopathy is characterized by being callous, unemotional, having fearless dominance, and pathological lying, as well as a few other characteristics. So again, the main overlap between NPD is with psychopathy, not so much with antisocial personality disorder, although there's some there. So when we look at the research on psychopathy, we do see that a lack of fear seems to be part of that construct. But there may be a lack of fear because the attention of an individual who's psychopathic is focused in a more goal-directed fashion. So they have a strong goal-directed orientation. So to simplify this a bit, they may have the ability to experience fear, but they're distracted. They're engaging in an activity so strongly that the fear might become secondary, or not even on the radar at all. So you could make an argument here that fear is really a common thread in all of the cluster B personality disorders, antisocial, narcissistic, borderline, and histrionic. So what if we were to extend this one step further and say, well, is fear a common factor in all personality disorders, not just the cluster B personality disorders? Well, in order to justify fear being an important element in both NPD and BPD, you don't have to extend it to all the personality disorders, but I thought this was an interesting question, so I'm going to answer this too. Is there a common characteristic with all the personality disorders? And of course, I would hypothesize that it's possible there is, and maybe it's fear. Now, of course, you could also argue it's lack of insight, which is, of course, what we see with all the personality disorders. But I'm really talking about something really more emotionally based here, not something like anosognosia, the lack of insight. So I'm going to stick with fear as potentially having the common thread status here. So what we see with cluster A personality disorders, we have paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal. So it's pretty easy to make a case for paranoid personality disorder having a fear component. How about schizoid personality disorder? I think this is probably the most challenging of the personality disorders to kind of pull this common thread of fear in. I think that you may not see really fear with schizoid personality disorder, but some discomfort in social situations. So maybe a little bit there. Now, schizotypal social anxiety is part of the disorder, so you would have a fairly good case that could be made there for fear in schizotypal personality disorder. Now, moving into cluster C personality disorders, this is the anxious, fearful cluster, so it's pretty easy to conceptualize fear in that cluster. With avoidant personality disorder, we see a fear of rejection, similar to what we see with borderline personality disorder. With dependent personality disorder, we see a fear of loss of support, or being unsupported, or being alone. So again, pretty similar to borderline. And with obsessive compulsive personality disorder, OCPD, we see a fear of not being perfect. So this has a strong overlap with NPD. We also see a fear of not following the rules. That's a little bit different than what we'd see with NPD, but it's still another fear. So in a way, fear might be a common thread for all of the personality disorders, but the specific type of fear, of course, would be different for each one. Connecting back to the original question with NPD and BPD, I would say probably a fear of shame, a fear of betrayal, and ultimately a fear of pain. In particular, emotional pain. Pain based on something going wrong or something that's not ideal in a relationship or how someone is thinking or perceiving someone else. So, interesting question. I really enjoyed looking at this question and doing my best to answer it. I think whenever we talk about NPD and BPD, of course, there are a lot of different opinions. And as always, I would like to see those opinions in the comments. If you have any thoughts about what might be a common factor across NPD and BPD, please put those in the comments. I hope you found this discussion of BPD and NPD to be interesting. Thanks for watching.